Hey, this is Tim back for Wrong Sports, and if you have checked out any of my lists before, you might know that I like to do lots of lists, especially on worst teams. I also did best teams, but I really like to cover worst teams or teams that you might not have heard about. That is what this new series is going to entail. I'm going to be doing deep dives on the longest streaks in college football. That means losing streaks. Yes, we're going to do losing streaks first, and then I'm going to be doing winning streaks, but first you got to get through all these losing streaks first. Now, since I did a video on the worst Division III programs, I thought that my first deep dive should be on my Division II representative, which is the Lock Haven Bald Eagles in the mid-2000s. But before I give you a little history lesson on the Lock Haven Bald Eagles, make sure, as always, you like this video, you share this video, you subscribe to the channel, please, and also make sure you follow me on Twitter at SportsWronged, and make sure you leave me a comment at the bottom of this video telling me what you like about the video, what you don't like about the video, and what other teams you think I should be covering. But let me start by telling you a little bit about this Pennsylvania school that is pretty much smack dam in the middle of the state. It is a public college and state-owned like its counterparts in the conference that it's in, the Pennsylvania State Athletic Conference, which has a lot of great history, which I will cover in a future video. But Lock Haven, even though they play in the PSAC, they aren't known for any real athletic achievements in the last 20 years or so, with their most accomplished team being their field hockey team, which has won 7 national titles and competes at the D1 level. They have also won some national titles in softball in the 2000s, but otherwise nothing really else. But even with some of these good athletic achievements, the school will now be known as having the worst losing streak in D2 history and the 3rd longest overall, behind Earlham College in D3, which I covered in my previous video, and a school in the FCS, which I'll be covering in a future episode of this series. But before I get to their epically long losing streak, let's start this deep dive by going to the beginning of this century with 2000 in Lock Haven. They had a 3-8 record, and they went on an epic 5-game losing streak to end 2000, where they gave up 50 points 3+ times, which you will be hearing that phrase a lot throughout this video, and they were shut out 3 times. They followed that with a record of 3-8 in 2001. Then in 2002, they had their best record since about the mid-80s with a 5-6 record, but then they followed that up in 2003 and 2004 with a 3-8 record, and their coach Mark Luther left after the 04 season. So this meant that Lock Haven would have to bring in a new coach, and they found one in former player John Classic. He was a former assistant at Youngstown State for 15 years when they won 4 national titles, so this guy was coming in with some pretty big credentials. Unfortunately, it didn't start out very well, as in 2005 they were 2-9. They followed that up with a 2-9 record in 2006, before 2007, where they started on a 10-game losing streak and were only shut out once, even though they scored a field goal in 2 games to not be shut out, so they probably should have been shut out a few more times. They won their last game over Clarion by 3 in overtime to win their first game of the season and their first conference game too, and that win was very significant because if it wasn't for that final win at the end of the season, this losing streak would have been a hell of a lot longer. Okay, but now we are in 2008, which is where the streak actually starts. John Classic is still the coach of this team. They did go through some changes on defense with graduations, as well as also starting a new quarterback. Lucky for them, though, their running game really didn't change that much, as their running back Ibrahim Smith ran for over 500 yards the previous season and caught passes for over 100 yards last season. He was back this year. They also started this season versus Glenville State out of West Virginia, and the offense wasn't clicking since they were starting a new quarterback, as they only had 86 yards and 0 points. The defense didn't make it close either, as they gave up 400 yards and were down 30-0 at half, and that would be the final score too. So not a good way to start off this streak. Game 2 didn't get any better, as they played ranked Westchester out of their own conference, as the game started and was pretty much over after 6 minutes, as Westchester was up 14-0. Lock Haven, though, did get their first points of the season in the first quarter as Ibrahim Smith scored, but of course they missed the extra point. Actually, it was blocked, so they were down 14-6. Lock Haven, though, got nothing else as Westchester scored the next 23 points to be up 37-6 at half, which was strangely the final, and you'll be hearing that a lot because a lot of teams would seem to get the picture about Lock Haven and would start to bench a lot of their starters in the second half. The defense was the issue, though, in this game, too, as they gave up over 450 yards, But a bright side was, though, they did intercept the Westchester quarterback twice, but by the time they did this, the game was way over. Game 3 was more of the same, and I'm just going to make it short and sweet, as they played Shippensburg, and they were shut out. They gave up 475 yards on defense, and they had under 100 yards on offense. So yeah, it was a dominant loss. We're just going to move on. Game 4 was actually looking like it could be something, as they played IUP, which is Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and IUP was ranked in the top 15, and they were undefeated. IUP did score first, but turned the ball over at their own 29, allowing Lock Haven to go on a 7-play drive, and again, Smith would score, and the team actually converted the extra point, so they were tied for the first time. This was the first time they were tied, besides it being 0-0. The score stayed until the half, but after that, IUP realized they probably should be winning this game now, because they would come out of half and score within 2 minutes, then they scored again 5 minutes later, then they recovered a fumble for a touchdown, and scored a touchdown again, all in less than 11 minutes, and they would be up 35-7 before the quarter was over. The final was 45-7, and again, Lock Haven gave up over 400 yards, and the IUP defense scored more points than Lock Haven's offense did, as IUP blocked a punt in the fourth for their final touchdown. So now Lock Haven's streak is at 4, as they played the 3-1 Edinburgh from the PSAC in their Game 5. This was a significant game because the defense didn't give up 400 yards to their opponent, as they only gave up 391 yards, so a little improvement. Their offense also had 185 yards of total offense, which was the first time they had over 150 yards of offense. The only thing was that Lock Haven didn't score any points, even though their offense improved, but they lost 31-0, so let's move on. Game 6 was looking a little bit better as they played Mercyhurst. They lost, but of course there were some positives. First, they actually scored some points in 14. This was like the first time they scored double-digit points, by the way, both on touchdowns, and they were passes. Yeah, they actually had passing touchdowns. This was the first time they actually did that. It wasn't enough, though, as they were back to giving up 400-plus yards on defense, and they lost 49-14. Well, you saw a little bit of improvement, but Game 7, they did not improve at all, and actually it was really brutal as they played a top 10 team from their conference in the California University of Pennsylvania. And I know there's a lot of schools in this conference with names of states like Indiana University and California University, so I'm sorry if you're a little confused. But anyway, California was ranked and they knew how to score, and they jumped on Lock Haven early, scoring 2 quick touchdowns in the first 10 minutes, but then Lock Haven would get some points before the half on a field goal after a fumble. So at halftime, the score was pretty close, but then someone flipped the switch for California, because when they got back on the field, they went on to score 5 straight touchdowns to win this game 56-14. Due to the score, you can guess that Lock Haven gave up 400-plus yards on defense, and actually they gave up 599 total yards, with 358 of those yards being from the passing game. Oof, like I said, that one was brutal. But Game 8 was their best game all year, and it might have been because last game was so bad, but also this game was good because they were playing the team that they beat last year in Clarion. Clarion were coming into this game 1-6, and Clarion actually took a 14-0 lead into the half. But in the third quarter was where all the craziness happened, because first Lock Haven went on a 10-play drive for their first touchdown, then Clarion got the ball back but were intercepted, and Lock Haven had the ball on the 2. They would run it in on their next play to tie it up, and then Lock Haven got the ball back quickly in the third and would score on their second touchdown pass of the day to take their first lead, 21-14, and it would actually be the latest in a game they would ever have a lead, and they never had a lead in the second half all throughout this season. Lock Haven wouldn't have the lead all that long, though, as Clarion tied it before the quarter was over, and then the fourth quarter was back and forth, but Clarion was able to kick a field goal with 3 minutes left to take the lead and eventually win. Lock Haven had their best offensive output in this game, though, with 182 yards, but once again, they gave up 400-plus yards, but the turnovers really kept Lock Haven in this game, so the defense is actually showing a little bit of improvement, even though they're giving up tons of yards. At least they're getting the ball back. So with the last game being an absolute gut punch, these next two were absolute disasters, as they first played Gannon University and got shut out by them, not getting over 100 yards on offense. Then next week, they played Slippery Rock University, and they had a better offensive outing there, getting 140 yards of total offense, but that only gave them 7 points, and they lost 45-7. And even though the final scores might be bad, these two games were a lot alike on defense, but for something good, because they didn't give up over 400 yards of defense. So at least that's something positive for them. But now Lock Haven's 0-10, and they had one last chance to get a win and not have a winless season, as they would play CW Post. This wasn't a conference game, and CW Post was looking for another win as they had 2 on the season. The game was actually back and forth, but Lock Haven never had a lead as they were down 14-6 at half, and Lock Haven got within 8 with less than 8 minutes left. Lock Haven would score, but on the tying 2-point conversion, they couldn't finish the deal to go to overtime, and they couldn't get the ball back, and they ended their season 0-11. Well, the first 11 games of this very long losing streak are in the book, and the 2008 season was actually not the worst of this run that they will have, because they did score 86 points this season. They did give up 409 points, which is a lot you would think, but it actually gets worse as we go on with this school, meaning that this school lost by an average of 30 points every game. They only scored an average of 8 points per game, giving up 38 points per game. They were shut out 4 times. Their offense was atrocious. Obviously, is only averaged 147.5 offensive yards per game. They also gave up 437 yards per game, which is just awful. And like I said, it would only get worse as we would continue here. Okay, so the 2008 season is over. John Classic would stay through the 2008 season. He would come back for this 2009 season. And I'm going to be doing this 2009 season a little bit different because I'm not going to be going over this season game by game, but I'm going to be putting them all into groups. But first, before I get to that, let me preface this by saying that this was the worst offensive year of the losing streak, as they could only manage 4 passing touchdowns and 4 rushing touchdowns the entire season. Yeah, their offense was a mess with lots of injuries and changes, as they had 4 different quarterbacks and only 3 of them threw touchdowns, and their rushing attack, which was one of the most constant parts of their offense in 08, was worse this year, as the running back from last season, Ibrahim Smith, only played half the season and resulted in under 700 total yards for the season. But another sad fact for the season was they lost over 575 yards, meaning they only had 102 net yards of rushing for this season. So yeah, just a terrible season, but let's start. So after knowing those stats, their first 3 games would go just as you would assume, as they played 2 out-of-conference opponents before playing their first conference game versus Clarion. Their first 2 games, they only scored 1 touchdown by who else? Ibrahim Smith, in a 49-7 loss to Shippensburg, and that was after getting shut out in their very first game. Clarion was in game 3, and they were coming to the game 2-2, and they were looking to make it 2 in a row, and it would be very easy for them, even though they had less than 300 yards on offense, but they did score 24 points. They didn't even need to score that many, as Lock Haven had their passing offense go nowhere, as they had an interception, and they had only 180 yards of passing, but -7 rushing yards, which definitely hurt them because they couldn't get into the end zone, and they lost 24-0. So there you go, quickly, they were 0-3, and now the losing streak was at 14 as they went into game 4. They played Mercyhurst, who were 2-0 in the PSAC and 3-2 overall. Lock Haven played their best defense though, as it was only 6-0 with 10 minutes left in this game. But then after 2 late touchdowns by Mercyhurst, it looked like this game was going to be out of reach. But then Lock Haven finally got in the end zone with less than 5 minutes left, and of course, it was Ibrahim Smith again. But unfortunately, Lock Haven couldn't get the ball back, and they lost 19-7. So now Lock Haven were 0-5, and they welcomed the 5-1 Edinburgh University, who systematically beat down Lock Haven with 199 passing and rushing yards to score 34 points before Lock Haven even got in the end zone to once again not be shut out, and they lost this game 41-6. These 2 games should have resulted in better outcomes, but because of the negative rushing yards in both of these games, they couldn't even manage to get garbage time touchdowns. And the final game of this trio, and their 6th game overall, was at home versus the California University of Pennsylvania Vulcans, and it looked a lot like these last 2 games I mentioned, but they did have some positive rushing yards though in this game, as they did have 35, and they did have a rushing touchdown in this game too, and nearly 200 total yards due to their passing game once again having over 150 total yards. It didn't help as they once again got beaten 48-14, but at least Lock Haven did score a touchdown in the third quarter, which was something they rarely did. Okay, so now Lock Haven is 0-6, but they would hit rock bottom with their game versus Indiana University of Pennsylvania, who were 3-4 and looking for their first conference win. And it would be an easy one for IUP, as Lock Haven had their worst offensive output with 33 passing yards. That's right, 33 passing yards, and they had minus 32 rushing yards for a total of 1 yard. Yeah, 1 yard this whole game. They obviously didn't score, and IUP were up 35-0 at halftime, and the game really should have ended there because IUP pretty much rested everybody in the second half, and they just ran the ball the rest of the game, as they had 328 rushing yards this game, and they won 45-0. Okay, and I know you can make it through the rest of the season because there's only 3 games left. Unfortunately, this game, it didn't get better for them. They played Gannon. They didn't give up a lot of points to Gannon as they only gave up 27, but they couldn't score any points. Luckily, Lock Haven did have positive passing and rushing yardage, but they still lost 27-0. Next up was Slippery Rock, and I want to do a pun using the name Slippery Rock and a crazy stat in this game as Lock Haven had 11 fumbles. Yeah, it was a slippery rock in this game. They lost 4 of them, though, too. This crazy stat resulted in negative 65 rushing yards. Wow. But here's some weirdness. They didn't have more than 65 yards of passing, so they had minus 4 total yards in this game. Somehow, though, they still managed a third quarter touchdown, which, again, I'm not sure. I really would love to see video of these games because I'm still not sure how they managed to score touchdowns with having minus 4 total yards in this game. But anyway, I'm going to assume that Slippery Rock fumbled as they had 4 in this game and they lost 1, and the touchdown that Lock Haven scored was a short one. But yeah, anyway, Lock Haven lost this game 47-6, and let's just move on to their final game. And their final game was their best one, which seems to be a trend as they played CW Post again, who were 5-5 and looking to beat Lock Haven for the second year in a row. And the game was a lot like last year as it was close throughout, but the biggest thing about this game was that their offense showed out, as their rushing offense had over 110 yards, which is just crazy for them, and they had more yards than CW Post did. But the turnovers hurt them as Lock Haven had 3 of them to Post's 0. Lock Haven was within a touchdown 3 times in this game and was within 5 points with less than 2 minutes left. But a final last-minute touchdown by CW Post resulted in this final being 27-15 and not looking as close as I just mentioned. Lock Haven, though, finished this season 0-10, and they did play 1 less game, which definitely helped the defense this season, as they gave up less than 400 total points. But yeah, that didn't help their averages on offense, as they scored 55 total points for the year, meaning they scored 5.5 points per game. They gave up 37 points per game, so they were pretty much losing every game by 4 touchdowns or more. They only had double digits twice in this entire season. Their total rushing for the season was 102 yards, as they lost 582 yards, meaning that they averaged only 10 yards of rushing per game. They had 8 total touchdowns like I mentioned before and were shut out 4 times. They only played 10 games this season, unlike other seasons where they played 11, but if they would have played 11 games, they would have definitely lost it and these averages probably would have been a lot worse. So if last season was bad for the offense, then this year was bad for their defense, and I don't want to ruin it too much, but they were back to their 2008 ways of giving up over 400 yards per game, but we'll get to that in just a second. That one stat, though, should help in assuming how every game went this season, as first they traveled to Virginia to play VMI, who are an FCS school, and not a terrible one, as they had a good passing game coming into the season. Well, that passing game had over 300 yards as they were up 20-0 before half. Lock Haven, meanwhile, had new running backs, but had their more experienced quarterback Jared Burkett back, and Burkett and the running game had over 150 yards and a touchdown just before half, but that was all they could get as they lost 48-6. Shockingly, they only gave up 351 yards to VMI in this game, and I say shocking because they were an FCS team. This isn't like giving up 351 yards to a Division II or Division III team. And these next two games I'm grouping up together due to their offense being at their best here. They started with a 350-yard performance versus Millersville, and they scored 21 points in this game, which is absolutely insane since you heard some of the other scores I've been mentioning. But they also threw for 4 interceptions, so the closest Lock Haven could get in this game was 7 points, and they lost 35-21. They did outgain Millersville by 5 yards, but the interceptions really hurt them in this game. Game 3 was at home versus Kutztown, who were 2-0, and it was a shocking start as Lock Haven scored first, which they rarely if ever did, as you've heard. Then they scored in the second quarter too, which is the first time they actually scored in the first and second quarter in these last 2 seasons. It was 14-0 with 2 minutes left in the half. Again, another first for Lock Haven, as they never had a lead going into half, but then something crazy happened to Kutztown, as they then proceeded to throw 2 touchdown passes in the last 2 minutes before half, and due to a missed extra point by Lock Haven, they were down 14-13 at half. Those last-minute touchdowns broke Lock Haven, and it was all Kutztown as they ended the game on a 24-0 run to win 38-13. Okay, and I'm going to be moving through these next 3 as quickly as I can because they were 2 shutout losses and they were butt ugly. First, they played 3-1 Mercyhurst, and even though they didn't score until the second quarter, they had 397 total yards, and since Lock Haven couldn't score with -5 rushing yards not helping, Mercyhurst still won 41-0. Next game was even uglier as they traveled to California, Pennsylvania that is, to play the undefeated Vulcans. Lock Haven's rushing offense was exceptionally awful as they had -50 rushing yards, which overshadowed their passing offense, which was over 50% completion percentage and had over 100 yards, but they still couldn't get in the end zone. California pretty much ended this game at half as it was 31-0 and the final was 58-0. So yeah, like I said, those last 2 are really bad. Anyway, next up was Clarion, who shut them out last year, and remember, they were Lock Haven's last win back in 2007. Lock Haven's offense, though, this game had 200 yards, which was crazy for them, but the scoreboard didn't show it because Clarion scored 14 points in the first 5 minutes, and it was 42-0 at half. In the second half, it was more of the same, but with about 3 minutes left, Lock Haven managed to get a 39-yard touchdown pass to score, and it was their first score and their first point in 13 quarters. Oh, by the way, they lost this game 49-6. So if you thought those last 3 games were bad, I'm just going to zoom by Game 7 because it was against Gannon University, and Lock Haven had a pair of fumbles, and even though Gannon couldn't score until the second quarter, they still managed to wipe the floor with Lock Haven as they won 42-7. Okay, so Lock Haven is 0-7, they got 4 games left, and I'm going to group up these 4 because Lock Haven scored points, like a lot of them. Like 70% of their points were scored in these final 4 games. First up, Game 8 was against Slippery Rock, who were 5-2, and this game wasn't like last year as I couldn't use my fumble pun here because there weren't that many. Lock Haven, though, in this game managed to score first, which was a rarity, and they did have 200 yards of total offense. Only thing was, Slippery Rock had 400 plus yards of total offense, and they won 56-14. Game 9 was versus Edinburgh University, and these games usually don't go well for them, as this game saw a little bit more improvement on their offense, as Lock Haven had 250 yards of total offense, which was the first time I think I've managed to say that, and also within this game, Lock Haven were within a touchdown 4 times. Edinburgh, on the other hand, had a game just like last year, as they had over 500 yards of total offense, which allowed them to outlast Lock Haven 30-22. So this was Lock Haven's first shootout in the last couple of years. Game 10 was a crazy one as it was against IUP, who were looking to win and put them back at 500. The scoring started early, and it happened often as after the first quarter it was 7-7. IUP's running game would flip the switch after half, with 4 rushing touchdowns, and they got 2 more touchdowns on 2 interception returns for touchdowns. And the turnovers obviously hurt Lock Haven because they had over 350 total yards in this game. They would score 31 points, which was the first time they ever scored over 14 points in a game. But IUP's high-octane rushing offense and all those INTs for touchdowns hurt Lock Haven from getting any closer, and the final score of this game was 63-31. So we got the final game of this slog of a season. Lock Haven are now 0-10. They're on 31 straight losses over the last 3 seasons, and they're playing Shippensburg, who were 5-5. And Shippensburg didn't want to waste any time on this one, and they wanted to get this game over with early, so maybe the refs would let them go home early? Anyway though, Shippensburg would throw 3 touchdowns in the first 16 minutes. Lock Haven would answer, but it didn't do much as Shippensburg would put more points on the board to make it 34-10 at half. Shippensburg, sensing it was over, looked like they pulled their starters in the second half, making for a boring ending to this 41-17 final game. It was a fitting way to end this season as Shippensburg had 500 plus yards of total offense, and they probably could have scored more if it wasn't for the 3 picks that Lock Haven got. Plus, Shippensburg did sit everyone in the second half. But this 2010 season was finally over for Lock Haven. They were 0-11, the streak was now at 32 straight losses. They did have their best offensive output in 2010 throughout this streak, as they scored 137 points, but most of those points were scored in the last few games of this season, as their first few games of the season, they were shut out or rarely scored any points. They did manage to average 12.5 points per game, but their defense was just atrocious, as their defense would give up the most points throughout this whole streak, as they gave up 501 points total, or 45.5 points per game. They also gave up 410 yards per game as well. But even though Lock Haven ended this season with their best offensive output, it would be a lot different for them, not only on the field, but off the field, as they would be looking for a new coach. So with the start of the new season, they brought in a new coach in John Allen. Classic left to become the offensive coordinator at Miami of Ohio, and left behind a program with 32 straight losses. Allen wasn't new to Lock Haven as he was a former assistant in the mid-90s, but the team he was seeing in 2011 was much different than the one he coached in the 90s. So first off, Lock Haven under John Allen was very different. First off, their offense was structured a little better as their offense had a pretty good 50-50 split between passing and rushing. Also this season, they would have their first 1,000-yard rusher in like more than a decade. To go along with that, they brought back their 2 quarterbacks that they started the previous season. So another thing that was positive for them, and maybe they could end this losing streak this year, let's see. Game 1 was versus Millersville at home. Millersville would hop on Lock Haven with a 14-0 lead in the first quarter, but Lock Haven came back to be down only 14-10 at half. After half, though, Millersville's offense and Lock Haven's passing offense turned this game into a close one, with Lock Haven kicking a field goal with 10 minutes left to make this game a 1-point deficit. Unfortunately, Lock Haven weren't able to get the ball back, and they lost 21-20. So even though they started out the season with a loss, at least it was a close one, and that was good because these next 4 games were not going to be close at all. Now let me say this first, their offense wasn't that bad in 3 out of their 4 games here, as they had over 100 passing yards in 2 of them, and they weren't shut out in any of the 4. The only thing was that they only scored 28 points or 7 points per game. With the offense kind of improving or at least getting some yards and some points, this means that the defense had to stand up just a little bit, and what do you think happened? Yeah, they didn't stand up at all. It was awful, as they gave up 199 points total, or just a shade under 50 points per game in these 4 games. They gave up 500 plus yards in 2 games against California, Pennsylvania, and Kutztown. Their worst performance was against Kutztown, who had 242 rushing yards and 296 passing yards. Their best defensive performance was versus Mercyhurst, where they gave up 398 total yards in a 42-3 defeat. So that shows you just how bad their defense was in these 4 games, that their best defensive performance was giving up 398 yards. So let's just move on, as Lock Haven is now 0-5. And they're giving up over 40 points per game as they trekked on through the season, now playing Gannon University, who either seems to beat up on them or shut them out during this run. Well, this game was close, however, for most of it, as it was 9-7 at half, but after that, Gannon outscored them 28-7 in the second to finish them off 37-13. Lock Haven didn't even deserve to be in this game, though, due to them having just a shade over 100 yards and giving up just a shade under 300 to Gannon. And the streak lives on as we get to Game 7 versus 6-1 Slippery Rock, who, like last year, were really good and they had a really good offense, too. Now, the final score of the game was 48-27, but it was not that close, as Slippery Rock had 34 points before Lock Haven was even able to score. Then the fourth quarter came around, and with a change at quarterback, Lock Haven was able to score 3 touchdowns to make this game closer than it really should have been, and also I'm pretty sure Slippery Rock had in their second or maybe third team at this point. Lock Haven did have 297 yards, but 3/4 of that happened in the second half. So now Lock Haven is 0-7, and that last game pretty much broke them because their final 3 games of this year all went pretty much the same. Lock Haven had over 200 total yards, but it didn't matter because in each of these final games, they were down 20 or more points early and they couldn't catch up. Example, in their 8th game versus Edinburgh, they were down 21-0 before they scored, and ultimately they lost 42-7. Then versus Indiana, Pennsylvania, they were down 42-0 at half and scored in the final minute to lose 56-6 and not be shut out. And finally, they ended their season versus 9-2 Bloomsburg University. And over the last 3 years, it seemed like Lock Haven had a great final game, but this final game wasn't good. Bloomsburg slowly scored, but they were up 27-0 at half, and Lock Haven kicked a useless field goal in the third to not get shut out again and end their season once again winless. Lock Haven did have some positives, especially on offense this season, as they had their second best offensive output during their streak with 10 points per game. They also didn't get shut out, and they had double-digit points 4 times. Again, a lot of it was because they scored against second and third string teams, but still, at least it's something positive. But their defense was so much worse this year, as they gave up 44 points per game, which was 1 point better than last season, which really wasn't all that great. Points per game might have been better, but their yards per game weren't, as they were average giving up 450 yards per game. That was by far their worst during this streak. Okay, you have made it through the worst because the streak is almost over. If you were a freshman at Lock Haven and you were on the team in 2008, you have never won a game up to this point. If you were a freshman in 2009, you are now a senior in 2012, and you still have not won a game. So let's see what happens here. John Allen was back as coach, and Lock Haven started this season with 3 just god-awful games. They first started versus FCS opponent Fordham, and Fordham at least made this quick, as they were up 21-0 after the first quarter, and they had over 500 yards of offense, and the final was 55-0. So let's just move on for that, because that's pretty much like an exhibition game for Fordham. Next up for Lock Haven was East Stroudsburg and their legendary coach Dennis Dudes, who has been coaching since the mid-1970s and had over 250 wins at this point. East Stroudsburg University threw the ball all game, resulting in 4 touchdowns and an easy 31-0 win. The last of these 3 was versus Indiana, Pennsylvania, who have been putting up tons of points versus our friends at Lock Haven, and it looked like early it wasn't going to be a blowout, as it was only 7-0 at half. But IUP then realized that they were playing Lock Haven after half and scored 4 touchdowns on the ground and had over 300 yards rushing in this game to win 42-0. So now Lock Haven is 0-3, and they haven't scored a point in any of these 3 games, and the streak is now at 45 straight losses. So not a great way to start this season, huh? And I mention that because these next 2 games are very significant to the streak, in that if Lock Haven loses these next 2 games, they now have the longest losing streak in D2 history. The old streak was set up only a few years ago in 2003 by Minnesota Morris, who lost 46 games and would eventually move down to Division 3. But let's see what happens with our Lock Haven friends. First, they started off well at home versus Edinburgh. Edinburgh has embarrassed Lock Haven over the years, but Lock Haven was going to embarrass them, as they had a 6-point lead early in this game, which was one of the first times Lock Haven had a lead early in the game since like 2010. Unfortunately, it wouldn't last long, as Edinburgh scored a last-second touchdown before half, and they had a 21-13 lead at half. Then the air was let out of Lock Haven as Edinburgh scored some more, and Lock Haven got a last-minute touchdown, but it was too late for them, and the final was 35-19. So now the longest losing streak is now tied at 46. So now they're getting ready for their record-setting game, and it went just how a record-setting losing streak game should go. Lock Haven played Shippensburg. Shippensburg got 14 points early and over 400 total yards of offense as Lock Haven set the record with a 49-6 loss. So now Lock Haven has the record with 47 straight losses, so anything after this is pretty much just gravy. And well, the streak almost ended at 47 as they played Mercyhurst next, and Lock Haven fought, and they had over 200 yards total, and they only gave up 245 yards to Mercyhurst, which again is a first in like a year and a half. Lock Haven also scored first, but it was only a field goal, and they couldn't score again until the second half, and by that time they were down double digits, and they lost this game pretty close, 19-10. Game 7 versus California, Pennsylvania was bad, and the less said about this, the better, because they lost 30-0. They had 116 yards to 470 plus yards from California, so yeah, this is bad. Let's just move on. Game 8 was really something special, though, as they played Clarion. Clarion beat their socks off last year, but Lock Haven played well versus them over this losing streak otherwise. Clarion was coming in 3-4 and gave up a kickoff return touchdown to Lock Haven immediately, but Clarion used their passing offense to be up 3 at half. After half, it was nuts though, as Lock Haven scored twice with their last score with a minute left to take a 28-24 lead. And yes, this was the latest they had a lead since, 2008 maybe? But before you start celebrating for Lock Haven, this was just a swift kick in the nuts, as Clarion went on a 90-yard drive in less than a minute and a half to score a touchdown and win this game 30-28. So the losing streak looked like it was never going to end after that one. The next game might have been a carryover from the previous game, as Gannon beat Lock Haven 13-7. The offense didn't even score, as it was off of an interception return for a touchdown. Slippery Rock was up next, and even though Lock Haven had over 200 yards total in this game, they were down 28-0 before the second quarter, and they lost pretty easily, 35-7. So I wanted to get through those last two games because I had to get to their final game. And since you have been so good on this journey with me, you have realized that pretty much every final game of the season for Lock Haven seems to look pretty good for them, with the exception of last year. But this year they were playing a team on their level in the 1-9 Cheney University. Cheney was going through their own troubles on the field and off of it, as they no longer play many sports, as they offer 2 sports at the Division III level, and their football team averaged 1 win for like the last 30 years, so they were not a good team either. So after hearing all of that, I might mention that Lock Haven hadn't played Cheney at all during this losing streak, and if they did, this losing streak may have been like 20 games less. But the game started off great for Lock Haven, as they had a safety in the first quarter and a weird 5-0 lead at half. Nothing happened again until the fourth quarter, when Lock Haven made it 12-0. They had a double-digit lead in the fourth quarter. Do you think they're going to make it? Let's see. This was their second biggest lead they had during this losing streak. It didn't last long though, because Cheney scored minutes later. Lock Haven then had the ball with minutes left, nursing a 5-point lead, and then kicked a field goal late to make it 15-7. Fortunately for Lock Haven, Cheney couldn't score again, and there would be no last-minute soul-crushing loss for Lock Haven. They did it. It was over. They won 15-7. This was their first win since November 3rd of 2007. The field goal posts were taken down. The players and the 2,324 fans in the stands in Lock Haven ran on the field and celebrated for hours and days as they finally won. Lock Haven got their win the same way their streak started, by winning their final game. This 2012 season, the winning season, they scored 92 points all season, or about 9 points per game, but they did average over 210 yards per game, so they were looking pretty good this season. Along with that, they vastly improved on defense, only giving up 31.5 points per game and gave up 404 yards per game, continuing that 5-year streak of giving up 400 plus yards. But only giving up 31 points per game was their best output by about 6 points. Also, during the streak, they gave up 2,056 points, or 39 points per game. Their worst season of defense going back was 2010, as they gave up 501 points, which was a top 5 high for a team in D2 history. To go along with that, this season they gave up 40 plus points in 8 games and 410 yards per game. On offense, they scored 459 points across 52 games, or about 9 points per game. They were shut out 14 times, or about 1/3 of the time during this streak. They did somehow go a season without getting shut out. That was 2011, but their worst offensive time was 2008 and 2009, as they scored 141 points across 2 years, meaning they only scored about 6.5 points per game. And that was giving them too much, because during 2008 and 2009, that was their worst stretch, as they were shut out 8 times. Here's some other interesting streak facts. It started November 3rd, 2007 and ended November 10th of 2012. This streak lasted through Bush's second term, the 2008 election, and 90% of Barack Obama's first presidential term. The 2012 election happened 4 days before the streak ended, so that can tell you how long this streak was. John Allen would coach Lock Haven until 2014, having his best record in 2013 with 3 wins, but he is now the coach on campus that is known for breaking the streak. They are still playing, and their most recent season, 2019, they went 2-9 with their defense giving up 49 points per game, so I see they are still the same team I fell for at the beginning of all this. Anyway, thank you so much for hanging out with me on this very long, deep dive journey where I went through the longest losing streak in Division II history. As always, make sure you like this video, make sure you share this video, make sure you subscribe to the channel, please. Also, make sure you follow me on Twitter at SportsWronged. Up next, I'm going to be doing a deep dive on the Columbia University epic losing streak that lasted just as long as the Lock Haven one. So stay tuned for that, and thank you so much for hanging out with me for Wrong Sports.